So for our first artist that we're going to look at with the Italian Renaissance, we're going to talk about the artist Giotto. So on your packet, you will see that we have two columns. The first one is for background information. So with each of the artists, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about them as an artist and some of their history. And then I have on the right side about their art pieces. So we're going to talk about some of their most famous pieces from this time period to help us kind of better see what the art looked like from this time. So we'll start by talking about the background of Giotto and who he was. So the first thing that we want to note is that he was the most famous painter of the early Italian Renaissance. So right at the beginning of the Renaissance, starting to become like an actual thing, Giotto was one of the first artists to have some success and actually be kind of acknowledged for the new styles that he was presenting. So he's kind of the godfather of the Italian Renaissance. So the second thing that we want to note about Giotto and his pieces is that he was the first painter to capture human emotion. First painter to capture human emotion and add depth to his pieces. And add depth, D-E-P-T-H, to his pieces. So kind of prior to Giotto, many of the artistic pieces that were being created, especially during the Middle Ages and prior to that, oftentimes the people that were depicted in these pieces have very kind of blank expressions that they don't have. They're not really the types of individuals that when you're looking at the piece, they're, making you feel something when you look at it. And Giotto was one of the first to actually try and convey human emotion with the figures that he was painting. And so that was going to make a very important change in art, because now when you look at a piece, it's trying to get you as the audience to relate and empathize with the emotions of the individuals within that piece. So that was an important change. Third thing that we want to note is that the subject matter were often stories from the Bible. Subject matter was often stories from the Bible. Now, this is going to be one of the very commonly used subject matters of this time period, were stories from the Bible. And Giotto was going to be one of the first to start to create pieces that were retelling particular stories from the Bible. We'll see that more in a second. And then the last thing that I want you to note about Giotto is that he used the fresco technique that we discussed before. He used the fresco technique. So now let's look at one of his most famous pieces, which is called the Lamentation. So if you're examining this piece, first and foremost, you can see that this particular piece is telling a story from the Bible. The story that it is telling is about Jesus after his death, after the crucifixion. And you can see that he is surrounded by other biblical figures, as well as if you look up into the sky, you can see angels, and all of those individuals are grieving and mourning over Jesus's death. And so, if you're looking at this piece carefully, you can see the human emotion that we discussed, that their faces are very kind of distorted. You can see that they are crying and emotional. So that was a technique that he was using with these pieces. We could also see that this fits with the subject matter we discussed, using stories from Christianity and from the Bible. And that this particular piece is using that fresco technique. If you're looking carefully, especially if you look in the background towards the sky, you can see cracks and ridging where the paint was drying at some different rates. And so as a result, it created kind of an interesting texture and color because of it being painted directly on the wall. So this particular piece, the Lamentation, is highlighting those different types of techniques that were used in that time period, as well as telling the story of Jesus's death and the different figures that are surrounding him following that, using that human emotion to show that they are grieving and mourning.